Okay, hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jason Gumpert from MSDynamicsWorld.com. Thanks for joining us for today's event. This is the next session in our AX Education webcast series presented by I.B.I.S. Today we're joined by Andrew Stevens, a senior consultant at I.B.I.S, who will be presenting on AX inventory and reservations and allocations. To get this event started, please know that we do invite you in the audience to add your feedback and ask questions today during our presentation. You can use the Q&A panel that you should see to the right of the slides to ask your questions, and Andrew will be making time at the end to take all of those. We will also have a poll, a brief poll coming up in the next couple minutes here, so be on the lookout for that. And without further delay, let me hand it off to Andrew.
Hello, welcome. My name is Andrew Stevens, and today's webinar we're going to be talking about configuring inventory, reservations, and allocations in Microsoft Dynamics AX. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of info about myself. Like I said, my name is Andrew Stevens. I'm a senior consultant who has worked with Dynamics for about 7 years, or a little over 7 years. I also have a manufacturing engineering background, and I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. To start with, I'd like to provide you with just a little background on the host of our AX Educational series and the company that I work for. I.B.I.S is a Microsoft Gold partner focused on Microsoft Dynamics AX, CRM, and GP. And I.B.I.S has been in this business for about 26 years, and our primary strength is in the supply chain space, and we're very focused on client care and services. So before we begin, Jason mentioned that we would have a quick poll, and so we're going to ask each of you a quick question that you should see momentarily on your screen, just simply asking which version of AX you're currently using. Please just take a moment to answer, and then we'll begin. So in this webinar, we have two primary objectives. First is to describe the functionality of reservations and allocations within Dynamics AX to give you a better understanding of how it works, and to learn some of the advantages as well as implications of using or implementing reservations within your business process.
Andrew, that poll is just closing out right now. We should have the results in about 10 seconds.
Okay. So these are the topics that I'll be covering today. We'll start with an introduction to reservations, a little bit around terminology, and then we'll move through examples of reservations in sales and production and look at reservations and warehousing while all along touching on the setup that's required for each step along the way. So there are several benefits to using reservations. The primary benefit is, of course, to ensure that your customer's order goes fulfilled by existing inventory or expected inventory. And the inventory does not get allocated or shipped against a different customer's order, for example, or just a different order in general. This also allows you to see the status of your current inventory and whether that inventory is waiting to be shipped or used, or if it's reserved and just waiting to be picked. Reservations will also allow users to reserve against batch-controlled inventory, based on, for example, a first in, first out principle, or based on the earliest expiration dates, based on the batch number's expected shelf life, as well as requiring the reservations reserve only from a single batch number. So rather than potentially reserving a transaction against multiple batches, you could indicate that it could only be reserved from a single batch for a particular transaction. You'll also have the ability to reserve inventory at different levels, meaning that if you're using sites, warehouses, locations, even batch and serial numbers, you'll be able to reserve inventory down to only the level that best suits your needs. So often when people think of allocations, they often, in my opinion, confuse the idea of allocations with a reservation. From strictly an AX terminology point of view, they're the same. So if you see allocations or references to allocations in AX, that's typically going to refer to a reservation. But in reality, people will use the idea of an allocation to simply mean that inventory is or will be available when it's needed based on delivery dates or orders. The terms hard and soft allocation are often used to refer to the difference between an allocation and a reservation. In AX, reservations will be considered hard allocations. Soft allocations will be handled just by standard AX processing. No setup other than ensuring that master planning is set up and will be utilized. And to further explain that idea, all inventory and expected inventory is seen by AX and will be taken into account when master plan is run. So AX will not tell you to purchase or manufacture items where existing and incoming inventory are sufficient to cover the demand, so long as they will arrive by the required dates. So no reservations would need to be set up for just the allocation to take place, as this is part of just standard master planning and is also visible when you view inventory levels. The allocation of inventory occurs as soon as an order line is entered and the transaction is created for that item and the quantity is considered to be on order rather than reserved. Master planning will then use all the information from all the transactions, sales transactions, production transactions, transfers, journals, anything else, to determine how much inventory is needed after all the inventory is allocated to the existing demand. So master planning will only create planned orders, planned purchases, production, transfers, whatever is needed, when the inventory that's on hand is insufficient to cover all demand by the required dates. After master planning is processed, it'll show you exactly why each planned order was created, essentially allocating the planned orders against the actual demand. And this is called pegging. That does not mean that the potential inventory on these planned orders will be reserved for the reference demand if they're turned into a real order, but simply filling the allocation void for that demand. Okay, by looking at the on-hand inventory inquiry form out of inventory management, the allocation of inventory without the use of reservations can be seen on the first line in this example screenshot. You may not be able to see it great, but that's okay. I'm going to go through what the numbers and columns are. So the physical inventory value, which is the amount on the shelf, is 66 for this item. The available physical quantity, which is the amount of those 66 on the shelf that are not currently reserved, is also 66. So we have no reservations against it. And if you look at the on order column, this is the quantity that is required for all demand, both sales, production, transfers, anything. And it is a quantity of 10. So from an allocation standpoint, the total available column will show you the total quantity of inventory that's available to be used for any new demand. In this case, the value is 56. The 66 on the shelf minus the 10 that are on order leaves us, we have an unallocated quantity of 56. If you also have incoming inventory, regardless of the delivery date, the quantity is shown in the ordered in total column and will also be factored in the value that's shown in the total available column. So if you do not have enough inventory existing or incoming, the total available column will display a negative value. Reservations, on the other hand, will hold an exact quantity of inventory for that order line. You can also reserve a quantity that is expected to be received, and this is referred to as ordered reserved. Just as a side note, the use of reservations is required if you're using AX R3 WMS functionality, as the information that's used for picking material cannot be created if the material has not been reserved for that order. When reservations exist, all demand is still accounted for when master planning is run, but no reserved transaction will lead to a planned order that is covered by the inventory it's reserved against. So the planned orders will be created for all unreserved transactions where existing inventory or anything that's incoming is insufficient for the requested date on that demand. It's also important to note that by using reservations, you're intentionally making it difficult to remove the reservation against inventory. For example, so it can be allocated somewhere else, or for whatever reason you may want to remove a reservation. The way to remove a reservation is to refine the reserve transaction and remove the reserve quantity manually. This will help you prevent inventory that's promised from one customer from being mistakenly reserved or unreserved from that order and then onto a different order. But since removing reservations is so manual, it puts a huge importance on the accuracy of your inventory levels, as inaccurate inventory levels will lead to missed delivery dates and also require a manual process of removing them so that the levels can be corrected before any new reservations are created. So with reservations in place, you get a different picture when you look at the on-hand inventory form again. In the example shown is the first line of the screenshot again. This high-end cabinet item has 22 units of physical inventory, and by looking at the physical reserve column, we see that all 22 units are reserved against existing orders. Next, by looking at the ordered and total column, we see that 20 units are on order and expected to be received into inventory at some point. And we also have a column for ordered reserved that shows that all 20 of those units on order are reserved as well. And since there are 41 units on order, so if you look in the on order column, there's still 41 units there, that leaves us 41 units short of fulfilling all demand for that item. So we have the negative 41 value in the total available column. So in order to use reservations appropriately, there's potentially several forms that will require your setup. This is a list of the forms that we'll cover where the setup will have an impact on the reservations and how those reservations are used. We'll start with the item model groups. So once they're set up, a single value selected on each release product. So every release product will have an inventory model group associated to it. And when you're setting up the inventory model groups, there's a field for item sales reservation, which will determine if a reservation should occur automatically or manually for each item when it's added to a sales order line. The setting here will override any default setup for reservations, as well as the reservation process on the sales order if you change it manually from order to order. And if you choose a value of default in this field, it'll just use the standard setup for the item every time on sales lines. All the other fields in this section that we've got circled and this reservation field group won't be applicable if the release product uses batch numbers, and those batch numbers are part of the information that gets reserved. So FIFO date controlled will reserve a batch number based on the earliest date the batch number was received into inventory. And if you select that, you also have the option of backward from ship date, which really works like the principle of LIFO, where the inventory will be reserved based on a last and first out, or the batch number will be chosen as closest to the delivery date of the transaction. The same batch selection field will allow the user to specify that the transaction must be filled from a single batch number and not from multiple values. So this is where we can say whether a transaction line must be filled by a single batch number rather than splitting it up over multiple ones. And then the FIFO date controlled option will use expiration dates to determine which batch number should be reserved. So those expiration dates would then be maintained against each batch number. Okay, like the item model groups, each release product must have a storage dimension group specified on it before transactions can be created for it. And storage dimensions are very important in how reservations are created. The key column on this is the physical inventory column, which is the one that's highlighted. And this checkbox will determine to what level inventory is reserved for an item. So, for example, if you want to reserve inventory only at a warehouse level and not reserve from a specific location, then you would not check the box for physical inventory on the location row, just on the site row and the warehouse row. Okay, so similar to storage dimension groups, you also have tracking dimension groups, which must be specified on the released product before you can create transactions for that product, and they're just as important as they allow the setup of reservations to occur against batch and serial numbers. And they work in almost an identical fashion. So if you select that physical inventory checkbox for either the batch or serial number line, then it would be included in what gets reserved. The next piece of setup information is the Inventory and Warehouse Management Parameters form. There's one very key checkbox here. So in the general section, the field reserve ordered items controls whether or not the reservation can occur against ordered transactions. So for example, if you check this, and I create a sales order line and allow AX to automatically reserve inventory, but there is no inventory for the item that I'm selling, but a purchase order does exist for that item, this will allow AX to reserve against the incoming purchase order. As we'll see later, there's a scenario where even though this checkbox is selected, reserved order transactions can still be created. So now that we've looked at some of the base setup that affects reservations, let's take a look at the transactions. This is where the information about each specific reservation is stored and where it can be seen. So the transactions will show the exact amount for each reservation and all the detail of the reserve dimensions. You just need to look for a receipt or issue status, which are columns on the transactions form. And you would look for a status of either reserved ordered or reserved physical. So reserve ordered is reserved against an incoming item. Reserved physical is it's reserved against existing inventory. A value of either ordered or on order indicates that there's no reservation existing for that transaction. So this form is extremely useful in managing reservations. Updates to the reservation can be performed directly off of this form as well. And we'll look at that process a little bit later on in this presentation. The transaction form can be accessed from a number of locations. The form can be opened from a released product record, which will show all the transactions for that product. It can be opened from a sales order line, even from an on-hand form as it is indicated on this slide and highlighted by the red circle. When accessed from the different locations or the different forms, it will only show the information that's applicable to the highlighted record when the form is open. So for example, if you open the transactions form from the sales order line, you'll only see transactions for that specific line. So this will help you quickly find the reservation information that you're looking for if you're trying to find information for either changing a reservation or just finding where a reservation exists against an item. So now let's look at the sales side of reservations, and we'll start with the necessary setup again. So in accounts receivable, there's a field for reservation, and it's just called reservation. And this is the default setup for how reservations are used on sales orders. When this value is set to automatic, all sales orders will default to automatic reservations when a sales order line is added to the order, and the inventory will be reserved if there's inventory available to be reserved. When a sales order is created, it uses the default reservation setting to determine whether reservations for the order will be automatic or manual. And this setting can be overridden on the order header. The header also has a field called reservation priority. This really isn't used directly for reservations on the order. It's really only used for filtering orders during other processes. Some of those other processes could include steps that create reservations. So each sales line on the order will inherit the reservation setting of the sales order header, which can also be overridden for each line. The only scenario where this will not use the value from the header is if the value for item sales reservation was set to something other than default on the item model group setup we discussed earlier. The reservation that's created will be associated to each sales line when created automatically or when you add the reservation manually. Skip the slide. After the sales order is created, the reservation value at the header level can still be changed. If it's changed to automatic, a dialog will appear when you save the record that'll ask you if you want to also change this value on all of your sales order lines. If you choose to update the lines, the reservations will be added for each of those lines wherever possible. If all lines on the order are currently reserved, changing this value from automatic back to manual and updating the lines with the manual setting will not remove any reservations. Once the reservations are set, the only way you would remove those on the orders would be manually. As mentioned before, each line can have a different reservation value, and just like the header, you can change the value from manual to automatic on the lines, and the reservation will be created for the sales line once it's saved if you were to change it from manual to automatic. And also, like the header, changing the value from automatic to manual will not remove the reservation if one already exists. It's from the sales lines that all reservations can be updated manually. We'll see this process later on, but the function for updating these is from each sales line is under the inventory button and the reservations option. So now let's look at how reservations work with production. We'll again start with necessary setups to use reservations. In the production control parameters, there's a default setup of how reservations are used on production orders. The values of this correspond to the stages of a production order, and the value will determine when in the production process the components of that production order are reserved. The release to warehouse field also has implications, as this setting can either be set to allow partial reservation or require full reservation. And this means that if you set this to require full reservation, that all components of that production order must be reserved before the inventory can be released to the warehouse for picking. And also note that this field will only affect orders that are using the WMS functionality of AXR3. When a production order is created, it uses the default reservation setting to determine when and if reservations for the components of the order will be created. The order is also created with a setting of allow partial reservation or require full reservation, which of course you can change from one order to the next and override the default, but it's always going to default to whatever's set up on your parameters. Each production BOM line, or the components of the production order, will inherit the reservation setting of the production order. Now on each of those BOM lines you can override it, but it will inherit whatever's set up on your production order. The reservation field on a production order or a BOM line can be set to any value between estimated and started. So anything after estimated and before started you can use for your values for reservations. The created status is where you would make any changes to the reservation field, and this is always where those reservations or changes to the reservation value should be made. So once the order is updated to any status other than created, if the reservation value is changed, this may not reserve the inventory of those components. So I would always recommend again to change it when the production order is in the status of created. So each step estimated through started can be selected as the step in which reservations will occur automatically. If you do not want to reserve inventory of components, the value here should be set to manual. And the values of each line in the production BOM can also be updated as well. And like the production order, should only be changed when the status of the production order is created. So just like on a sales order transaction, changing the value of the reservation field to manual does not remove the reservations. This would have to be done manually against each production BOM line if the order is in a status equal to or after estimated. And as stated before, the reservation value can be different for each line on the production BOM, and it of course will default to the setting from the production order, but it can be changed if and when necessary for each BOM line. But again, it should only be changed when it's in the status of created. One way to remove all the reservations on a production order, so all the reservations for the component items, would be to reset the status of the production order to created. This will also remove all the transactions for those BOM lines, but it'll take the reservations with it. And this is because the reservations are not created and the transactions are not created until the transactions are not created until the order is in a status of estimated or later. Reservations can also be affected by the master planning process. So we're going to take a look at the setup for controlling reservations through master planning next. So in the master planning parameters, the standard update section, there's a field called update marking, and this will control if the reservation can be created during firming of planned orders. But marking is a separate function from reservation. They're not one and the same. So before we get too far into master planning, let's just take a quick moment to look at how reservations and markings work. So for our example, we have a sales order line that's marked and reserved to a specific purchase order line. The reservation will reserve the incoming inventory from the purchase order to that sales order line, and the marking will tie the cost to the sales order. And it will create a reference on the sales line and the purchase line. So the reference on the sales line would be referencing the purchase line, and the reference on the purchase line would be referencing the sales line. So you have the correlation between the two. So now that we kind of understand the difference between marking and reservations, we already know that master planning will create planned orders based on unreserved demand. And master planning will create a pegging reference for each planned order. The pegging is the specific demand from which the planned order was created. So for example, a planned purchase order may be pegged against the sales order line for the same item and quantity. So when any planned order is firmed or is turned into a real order, this update marking value, which you would set on the parameters, is used to determine how marking and reservations get set on the firmed order lines. So if update marking is set to a value of either standard or extended, a purchase order may now be marked against the sales order line it was pegged against during the planned order phase, and the pegged sales order transactions will now be in the status of reserve ordered and reserved against the purchase order that was just firmed. So this is how master planning can update the reservations of demand orders or transactions. Okay, so now we're going to move on to how reservations work with R3 warehouse management functionality, and we'll start with the setup of warehouses. So in the warehouse management section, there's a field called reserve when orders are released by batch job. So this field is only used by the R3 WMS functionality and only applicable for warehouses that are set up to use the warehouse management process. So this field will allow AX to automatically perform the reservation of orders when they're released to the warehouse for picking, but only if that release to warehouse process is done via a batch job, which is located in the warehouse management module. The next piece of setup we have is called reservation hierarchies. So a reservation hierarchy is an order of storage and tracking dimensions that are used for reserving inventory. But again, this is only used in correlation with the R3 warehouse management process. So the dimensions on reservation hierarchies for site, warehouse, inventory status, location, and license plate, they're all required to be in the hierarchy, even if for whatever reason you're not using them. The batch number and serial number dimensions only need to be included if they are used in the associated tracking dimension group for that item. So the elements in a reservation hierarchy determine which dimensions must be recognized when the actual reservation occurs. The dimensions in the hierarchy that are listed below the location are determined in the warehouse during picking. So you do not need to provide the location and the dimensions that are listed below the location when you enter an order. However, if you want to make a dimension required at order entry, this dimension must be moved above the location value in the hierarchy. So for example, if you have a product that customers usually order from the same batch number, and that batch number should be determined when the order is entered, in this case, the batch number dimension must be listed above the location in the reservation hierarchy so that you're reserving against a specific batch. So real quick, the setup of a reservation hierarchy against a released product is on the released products form and is marked on this slide by the red circle on this released product. So this is where you would set up the reservation hierarchy against an item. And for your reference, this slide shows the steps that will be followed in the R3 WMS functionality and where the reservation and release to warehouse functions will fall within this process. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Just wanted to make sure you're aware of where the reservation occurs within that process. So within the WMS processes, the reserved inventory step must occur after the transaction is created, but before the transaction is released to the warehouse to be picked and shipped. The transaction cannot be released if the reservation does not occur. So the reservation for all warehouses that use the R3 warehouse management process will always use the reservation hierarchy set up on the item. So the location, for example, would never be a reserved dimension, but each item could be reserved differently. But in practice, reservations will be similar across most items and primarily differ where you have batch or serial numbers being used. So you usually won't have a whole lot of variation in your reservation hierarchy setup. So all dimensions that are required to be entered for the item but are not part of the reservation that will be entered by the picker. So for example, the location would never be part of the WMS reservation and would always require the picker to either enter or verify the location the inventory is being picked from. And oftentimes the batch number and serial number would also be entered by the picker rather than reserved, and that's if they are not above the location row in that reservation hierarchy. So these reservations must occur prior to releasing unless the batch process is run for releasing to the warehouse. We mentioned the parameter setting that you can use on the warehouse for allowing reservations when transactions are released using a batch process. When the batch process is used, those transactions can be reserved against automatically. So when you're not using the R3 WMS functionality, the picking workbench and inventory management is something that can be used for controlling your picking process. This form can also aid in creating reservations where they do not already exist. So when you set up the criteria that's used in this picking workbench, the inventory will be reserved during this process, and the pick list would only be created for items that can be reserved. So the last topic that we'll go through is how to update the reservations manually, which I mentioned earlier. So we've mainly focused on all the options that you have to automatically update reservations or when they need to be updated manually. So here are the steps to update a transaction's reservation manually. The first step is to get to the reservations form. So as mentioned before, the reservation form can be accessed from any transaction line, such as a sales order line, a transfer order line or the production BOM line once the production order is in a status past created. And when highlighting a record such as a sales order line, you would click on the inventory button, and then in the list of options would be a form called Reservations, which will open up the reservation information that's similar to what's shown on this slide. On this reservations form, the column for reservation will hold all the quantity and information for what is reserved or what can be reserved for the selected transaction. If a value exists in this reservation field and you want to remove the reservation, simply blank out the quantity. Just highlight it and delete it, and that will remove the reservation against that quantity. If you want to manually reserve the inventory, you would choose the line you want to reserve against and enter the quantity into this reservation field that you want to reserve against the order line. Once you update the quantities, closing the form will save the record and the transaction will be updated accordingly. So all the statuses will change on your orders, and all of the corresponding transactions would also be updated. That's how you would update the reservations manually. And this also concludes our webinar. So at this point, we can open the field for questions. Also, my contact information is displayed on the screen, as well as the information for I.B.I.S if you would like to contact either of us. And so now we'll open it up for any questions.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew. And just to remind folks, you can use the Q&A block that you should see to the right of the screen. We've had a few questions come in already, and I know Andrew is happy to get to as many as we have time for today. One question that I just thought I'd add that's been raised a couple times already is the recording of this event. We are recording it. We'll be making that available. We'll be sending out an alert to everyone who registered when that is ready to be viewed on demand. So first question that came in here, is there a way to use reservations only at a warehouse level in AX 2009? We seem to be stuck with reservations down to the location level, which is causing problems with stock moving between locations while under reservation.
So if the reservation is set at the location level, it's set on the storage tracking dimension. Now you can't go change the storage tracking dimension on an item. Once you have transactions against the item, you're locked into whatever your storage tracking dimension is. It is possible to change it on new items, so you could either create a new item to represent that item and use a different storage tracking dimension group that only goes down to the warehouse level. If you were to involve your partner and get some development work involved in it, I have seen it done in the past where you would blank out all of your transactions, remove all inventory, essentially close out anything occurring against that item, and then switch the storage tracking dimension group for it to one that only uses that physical inventory checkbox down to the warehouse level. And then, but that's something that you would certainly want to test and be very, very well vetted before you were to implement that into a production environment. The safest way, the most straightforward way, is to create it on a new item and set the appropriate storage tracking dimension. Just because then you're not changing anything, because AX doesn't want you to change the storage tracking or the storage dimension group once the item already has transactions against it.
All right. We had a question about getting access to the slides. We had a couple of people inquire about access to the slides, and Andrew's email is up there. But if you would like to make sure you get on the list to get those mailed out, just send us a chat or in the chat area with your email address, and we'll capture that and make sure that that you get a copy of those slides. Question in here, Andrew, what's the best practice for managing the big picture of reserving batches for many sales orders at one time instead of on an individual order basis?
So I'm assuming this would be not necessarily reserving the items. So if you don't want to reserve the batches, you just wouldn't reserve them, and they would either be selected during the picking process. So if you have a whole lot of different batches and it doesn't matter which one goes out on a particular sales order line, then you just simply would never reserve down to the batch level. It would be part of what's required before you would ship it, but you wouldn't necessarily have any reservations created for it. Now, if you still wanted to reserve specific batches, then probably the best that you're not going to be able to get away from a batch number being required on the sales line, but you can use some of the batch numbers control setups that we looked at on the item model group to determine which batch is going to be selected.
All right. Can sales order reservations be changed between sites?
Sales order reservations be changed between sites. So you can change the reservation. So your sales line is typically going to determine what site you're using. So if you have a sales line that's reserving inventory for a particular site, you want to change that and reserve it against a different site. Really what you would need to do is remove the reservation from the sales line, change the site on that sales line that it's going to ship from, and then either manually re-reserve it or let it automatically re-reserve. But once the inventory is reserved on that sales line, you don't have an option to update it in any way that's not manual.
All right. Does AX 2012 R3 allow for any reservation rules, namely reserving inventory when it reaches the replenishment delay window? If we have stock on an item, normal lead time is 30 days. Customer does not need parts for 90 days. Reserving inventory at the order entry time.
Okay, so there's not any rules around entering the reservation. So reservations are basically created or they're not created. So if you have orders basically that are not going to be delivered for 6 months, for example, and you don't want to create reservations for those right away, you're going to have to manage that process manually. So there's not anything that is going to run a process to 30 days out from when it needs to ship, create a reservation for that order. It's all controlled by the setting on the sales order. So if it's set to automatic, it's going to automatically reserve. If you don't want it to be reserved at that time, you'd have to manage it through your salesman, through essentially managing those orders. When they realize that order is 30 or 60 days or however many days out from shipping and the inventory needs to be reserved, they would then switch that order header to a reservation, or switch the reservation field to automatic. That can flow down to all the lines, and then all the lines would then be reserved at that point. But you couldn't set any rules to say after a certain amount of time, now reserve all of those order lines.
All right, a few more questions are coming in here. So another reservation one. The reservation drops off of an ordered reserved item if it has a quality order generated. When the quality order is passed, the item goes to available physical instead of physical reserved. What setup is needed to prevent this wiping out the reservation?
So this depends a little bit on which version of AX you're using. If you're using a version that has quarantine management, the quarantine management is essentially reserving your inventory. And it's saying that if that inventory is under reservation, that you do not want to use it. Or you're not going to be able to reserve against any inventory that's under quarantine management. If the quality orders are wiping out reservations, without knowing all the specifics and all the details, there is probably going to be a workaround to try to develop a process to still have quality orders, but not have those stealing reservations essentially off of your actual transactions.
And Andrew, this person is using AX 2012 R3.
Okay, so you're not using quarantine management. It's probably one where I'd have to know more of the specifics as to what that quality order, what's the scenario of the quality order when it's being created, and what transaction it's being created for, or is it being created manually. I'd probably just need a little bit more detail to answer it specifically, but quality orders, they can reserve inventory just like any other order.
All right. So here's a sort of a two-part question. So with R3, how would with R3 WMS, how would it work for making an order? Where does the product need to be produced based on shipments? And the person continues, what I mean is that if you release to the warehouse for creating shipments, it requires reservations, and to reserve you need inventory, but in a make-to-order ship, there is no inventory. Is there a method of dealing with that?
So typically probably what you would do in that scenario, so you will not be able to release that sales order to be picked. You wouldn't be able to release it to the warehouse until you actually have that inventory. So if it's a make-to-order scenario, then you would have to have your production order completed before you would be able to release that sales order. So if you want it to kind of happen, without too much human intervention into the process of releasing it to the warehouse, what I would suggest is have a batch process that runs that releases any of your make-to-order sales lines automatically. And if the inventory is not available, that it cannot be reserved. Or if you're not using, a reserve ordered status for between your sales line and your production order, then that inventory, then you can use that batch job to reserve the inventory automatically when it runs and have it automatically release all of your sales lines for picking. So once you finish the production order, depending upon how long you have set up between your batch jobs, that batch job would automatically release your sales line to be picked once the production order was completed.
All right, we have one more question right now in the queue, so let me just remind folks before I read that one that there is a very quick survey that pops up after the session. So if you could please look for that and spend like 15 seconds to just fill that out and let us know what you thought of today's event. We really appreciate it, both on our side as well as the presenter side. The feedback's really valuable. So last question that we have here, and if you do have any others, please do get them in now. If we have reservations at a location level, is there an easy way to transfer between warehouse locations without the need to manually remove and re-reserve reservations?
Unfortunately, no. So if you remember early in the presentation, we mentioned that once that reservation is set, AX doesn't like for you to change it without having a lot of manual intervention. So if you want to be able to change the location something's reserved on often, I would probably recommend not reserving down to the location level, maybe just reserving down to the warehouse level. You just can't get around the manually unreserving out of one location and then reserving into another location. If you just reserve down to the warehouse level, obviously you run the potential risk, of having reservations, not necessarily corresponding to the locations you want them to, but it's also going to allow your pickers to choose the location rather than having them directed to a specific location. But unfortunately, for reserving down to the location level, once that reservation is set, whatever level it's set to, it's a manual process to remove it.
All right. Well, we are going to start wrapping up here. Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time to present to us today and also take so many questions.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we are going to start wrapping up. Please do look for that survey. Thanks again to everyone for attending today, for your attention, and for all the great questions as well. With that, I will say thanks and have a great day.